Together, if that's okay. Wherever it is that you are, however it is that you are, get as comfortable as you can. And we're going to take three intentional breaths together. Okay? All right. Right. And if you also feel comfortable, you can close your eyes too. And then on the third breath, I just like us to be still for a moment. And then I'll get into it. Clear as mud. Okay. All right. Let's take our first breath together. Another. One last one. And if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. We're just going to sit in the silence for just a moment. Oh, weary heart, laden with earth's weight and care. Oh, feet, stumbling on the way, bleeding and bare. Oh, arms outstretched and hands upheld in prayer. Oh, back, which so oft has felt the lash and rod. Oh, soul, which cries aloud for the living God. Oh, life, struggling to free itself from the clod. Know this, there is no power from without. Yourself must answer every fear and meet all doubt with some divine indwelling power, which you yourself upon yourself shall shower. And giving, take, and taking, give, unto that life which you yourself shall live. I'd be remiss to not add in a little woo-woo. And so I'm lighting three incense sticks. You know that there's so many ideas around the symbolism of numbers, but in this instance, we're uniting mind, body, and what we might call spirit. I'm also lighting a candle to just to remind of the ever-present energy all around, burning that inner light that guides everybody. All right, I'm gonna take a sip of water. One, because my mouth gets parched when I speak and my nerves are high, but also to remind that life flows and that that which I take in will be released back into the great isness, and that everything is just one old circle. Kings and queens have imbibed this glass of water, paupers too, and just like them, I'm connected to all things, and so are you. So the title that I gave to Rev Barb is God is not in the details, and I'll speak more to that. But it sort of downloaded to me, um, and it has some significance for me. But it downloaded as the title talk, and I feel like it's an apt talk to have. Der Lieb Gott steckt im Detail. God is in the details. That idea was offered up by a German thinker, Gustav Flaubert, in the 1800s. And it sort of fit, I think, for that particular time. There was so much happening in the world, in the Western world, so much change, so much ideas that were being generated. We know that even as New Thought practitioners, so much of what we've come to understand as our philosophies was sort of birthed in that time, where there was this preponderance of information that was proliferating out into the world, and it was an exciting time. And the invitation there was to sort of remember that God is in the little things, is that, and that the attention to the little things is important. We recognized during that time too the development of the sort of industrial period, factories and the expansion, moving folks out from rural areas into to great cities, that attention to detail was so important. And there were so many details to be seen and had. But somewhat later, a philosopher that we might all know, Nietzsche, sort of countered that idiom with an idiom of his own. The devil is in the details. And the idea there, for folks who may or may not be familiar with Nietzsche, was that actually, it's in the simplicity that the complication lies. And in the complication, problems. And anyone who's ever not properly read a contract or clicked agree when you haven't given it enough time to read through and realize that you've just sold away your children and your children's children, that it sometimes can be true. And so God's not in the details is sort of my response to that a little bit. And if we think of this in more of a metaphysical way, Nietzsche's offering of the devil's in the details, we don't, as a matter of course, tend to believe in an actual embodied devil. That instead, what we recognize is that the only devil is an ego unobserved. The only devil is an ego unobserved. Those erroneous ideas held in mind that produce after their own kind. And we have to be mindful of those sort of thoughts that, as some would say, edge God out. And so the devil is in the details. And if we think about if the devil here is ego, how much ego gets caught up in details, takes simple things and makes them quite complicated. And it's funny too when I think about details, because details to me is also data, information. And at no other time in history have everybody under the sound of my voice and everybody who will hear me at some other point in time been in access to so much data, to so much details. We've never had at your fingertips, in the palm of your literal hand, you have access to more information than's been held by any of the ancient libraries. That a quick Google search can give you what a PhD in some past times wouldn't even have. And so the devil's in the details, I think, is becoming even more clear to us. That sometimes the details can bog us down in such difficult ways that more details, more data, more information actually produces more problems. And so I would offer like this, that God is not in those details. That while there is no spot that God is not, as our friends at UFBL would say, uh, sometimes the information, in fact, obscures God, obscures our connection to that which is. So around almost a decade ago, about 8 years ago, I picked up and moved away. I'd gotten a calling, I felt a prompting to start anew, and I left everything behind. Sold my home, left my partner at the time, picked up with a one-way ticket to England. I felt led. I've spoken on this before, but I feel like it's important to speak to again. And I ended up in England. And I've said this before too, that my first month was like I was floating. I was really felt like I was in alignment with spirit. At the time, I was studying ordained ministerial counseling through the pathways of Light Spiritual College and studying A Course in Miracles, and was feeling really on purpose in so much of my life. And that lasted for all of about a month and a half. And after that month and a half, I was consumed with and overwhelmed by grief. And that grief, it really almost threatened to sort of consume all of me. I was really broken up. And one Sunday, I was drawn to go to a church. And this church was a Quaker community. And this Quaker community, I don't know if folks are familiar with the Quaker community, but the Quakers are, interestingly enough, I would say they were quite new thought. And they sort of were birthed around about the same time. A lot of movements, including the abolition movement, were started by Quakers. And their belief system is rather simple. They believe in this idea that we all have access to God. There's this sort of divine priesthood that we all have access to, and that there's no need for sort of rituals and routines and hierarchies, that we all have equal access to God. And so I found myself one Sunday at this church community. And it was interesting because this church community does things very differently. And the way that they do it is, I'm going to actually make sure I get my things right. This church community does it like this. So you get into a very simple building, and in that simple building, there's a number of pews, and everybody sits around in the quiet. And they call this waiting worship. And you sit in that silence. And then there is what's called a period of vocal ministry. And in the silence, people are prompted, if they so choose, to share whatever is put onto their hearts. Quakers, and the Quaker movement was started by a man named George Fox, believe that in the stillness and in the quiet, spirit speaks, and that we all have access to what they capture as the inner light. And for those of you who are familiar with science of mind, the inner light is a lot like instinctual man or life, that indwelling God presence. And so you're sitting in a service, and truly, it's dead quiet. And then suddenly, someone will stand up and share and then sit down. And then that's met with another period of silence, maybe a minute, maybe 10. And then someone else stands up and shares. And those shares can be a sentence, they can be a whole monologue. Some people feel led to share a word, or in some instances, even a song. And then it's bookended by more silence. And then the silence is ended, and out of nowhere, everyone gets up and begins to shake hands. And then they go into the fellowship hall for tea and cookies. And so every Sunday, I found myself at this church community, and it boggled my mind. What are they doing here? What is this? But there was this also familiarity, this knowingness, this inner knowingness around what I was experiencing. And especially for me at this time, I'm in England, I'm 2 months in, I had been prompted by this sort of spiritual, like, enlightenment and liftment. And then all of a sudden proceeded rather by this sort of dark night of the soul. What am I doing here? What is this all about? Oh my God, I'm so miserable. Oh my God, I'm so lonely. And during that time, there was also a lot happening in the world. At that particular time, if folks remember, about 8 years ago or so, there was a large number of religiously motivated acts of violence in Europe and in the US and even in other parts of the world. People professing their faith were going out into the world and meeting that faith with ending theirs and others' lives. And I felt very conflicted. Here I am, you know, I had begun my journey with UFBL as a young teen, had been introduced to CSL and the work of Reverend Barbara, and had begun to study through CSL Toronto at the time, went on to study through some other programs, and was really immersed in some of the ideas that so many of us on this call are familiar with, and really felt opened by, right? Like I grew up in a religious home, but some of the ideas that I found in New Thought and New Thought Christian teachings were so much more expansive than the ones that I had come to know as a younger person. So much so that I had gone on to start a spiritual community that for some time was quite successful. Now here I am alone in England with no real connections, feeling very isolated, and really confronting my moment of doubt of faith. My dog. And that doubtful moment, that doubtful time, I remember sitting and I love me some James Baldwin. And I remember sitting and coming across a lecture, a talk that he had had with Malcolm X. And in it, Malcolm X was sort of saying to James, what the world needs is a bit more order. And if only the Black Americans could get rid of their white Jesus and find the answer in Islam, then so much of their troubles could be fixed. And James James Baldwin shared this. Goes, Malcolm, Black people don't need any more myth. What Black people need, like all people need, is just the courage to face life as it is. And I had this moment. I was like, oh my goodness. And I had this crisis of faith, and it was really beautiful and upending and all these other sorts of things. But still, without fail, almost every Sunday would find me in this little church at a community center in the center of town in northern England, sitting in the quiet with a room full of strangers. And it was during that time in England that I began writing when I wasn't oversleeping, head under covers, grieving. I was writing. And that process of writing and experiencing and feeling led me to the what has finally been this published piece of Pray You Break. And so I'm going to share with you a poem, a poem that is connected to the lesson title today. And what I'm going to offer to is I want you to feel what this sounds like for you. Right? I'd love you to leave whatever thoughts you might be having. Oh, that's well done. Oh, I don't like that. Oh, I would have written it a different way. And I invite you to feel what comes up for you as I share this piece. And even if the feeling is discomfort, or if the feeling is annoyance, or if the feeling is whatever, move out of the headspace into the embodied place and see how this sits for you. Let it fall apart, all of it. Don't rush to pick up the pieces. Let yourself lay out in the mess of you. Let them talk. Avoid the haste to fashion answers. They'd be false anyhow. Allow the uncomfortable, the feeling, the thrashing. Drink yourself sick if need be. Cry. F till your brains fall out. Dance. Work like a horse. Pray at every altar. Deny yourself too if it serves. Run. Then, when the savior that you've been chasing hasn't come, and the empty space your sense of you once occupied still remains unfilled, wait. Wait. Patience is less a virtue and more a happening. The one that comes without effort or holy aspiration. Earned easier by the whore than to the chaste and to the righteous. Dark gutters and lonely gallows school quicker than any tower bleached ivory. God isn't in the details, but in the dirt. Black like absence or stillness. The silence left behind when our prophets and princes and the imagined man above forsake. There it is. There it has always been. But first you must break. So that piece came to me in various iterations, came to me during that time. And what it sort of, I think, reminds is that it's in the darkness, in the difficulty, in the absence of answers that we're being invited to listen. God isn't in the details. God isn't in the data, the mass of information. In fact, actually, we're not built for all of that. John Haidt recently wrote a book about the anxious mind. And in that book, he writes about how the internet and social media has begun to literally change the way minds are working, particularly young minds, and how that has translated into increases in anxiousness and depression amongst a number of age groups, but in particular, younger age groups and amongst women. And so you think at this time where we have got so much detail that this must be emancipatory. We must feel so much better and bigger and expanded. And in fact, what we're seeing is the inverse. that in the amassing of all of this data, in the drowning of all of this information, in the overwhelm of all the details, Nietzsche's statement is there in full and effect. The devil is in the details. The devil's in the details. But God is in the dirt. God is in the feeling. So I invited you to get out of your head, get out of your thinking space, right? The sort of logic-oriented brain trying to, right? I don't like the way he used his prose there, and whatever, whatever. And go into the embodied place. What does it feel like? The same thing I was being called to do when I was in England. I had all these ideas about myself, about God, about the world. So much so that I was out there preaching and teaching and speaking and learning and I remember being with one of my instructors, and I remember I had done the homework, and we were in our one-on-one class, and he had asked me to sort of review with him what I'd learned. I said, God is love. I made a statement somewhat like that. God is love. He goes, do you know that? Reverend Ken Gorman. You can Google him. Reverend Ken Gorman, great guy. He goes, do you know that? What? Yeah, yeah. He goes, how do you know that? Well, what do you mean? Literally, we were studying this. This is in the textbooks. He's like, yeah, you've read that. You might even believe it. But do you know it? And at no time had I ever uncoupled the idea of hearing, believing, and knowing. I'd never uncoupled that idea that just because I believe it, or just because it's been said or Googled, doesn't mean that it's known. And that, in fact, so much of what I thought that I knew, I had just absorbed and believed and performed by rote. But I didn't know. And that to really be, to really be in right relationship with some of the things that we say what we believe in religious science and Centers for Spiritual Living and Unity and United Foundation for Better Living and divine science and agape, whichever of the new thought streams that you perhaps adhere to, you have to know it. And that knowing requires a different kind of relationship. It reminds us that it requires us to walk it out, to walk it out. Um, in Science of Mind, there is a piece. I'm going to just read you just this excerpt alone, just to help us to ground it in some of what we have learned. And so they talk about the extinctive man, here also known as the inner something or life, Ernest Holmes says, which we do not see, but which is, of course, there. We might say that instinctive life is God in man, or the idea of God working through man. But if instinctive man is an idea of God, why is he not perfect? The answer is that he is perfect, but that as soon as individuality is evolved, he must be left alone to discover himself. Even God cannot make a mechanical individuality. If man is created with the attributes of self-choice and free will, he must be let alone to make the great discovery for himself. We note that from the day when instinctive life brought man to the point of self-choice, it let him alone. And from that day, instinctive life has waited on man's unfoldment. It is true that during all this time, it has carried on the automatic functions of the body and has even silently told man what to do, but it has let him alone in all other ways. It may and must hold man as a perfect being, but it also must let him discover this fact for himself. During all of this time, however, instinctive life or God must be silently waiting for the great discovery to be made and must always be ready to respond to man's advancement. That yes, we're perfect, we're whole, we're complete. That isness that's back of all things is not impacted by our personality and our missteps and misspeaks and mistakes. But we forget. That is the great sin. That is the great falling short. That is the original sin. That to be human means to forget that you are connected to that perfect source. It is also to be imperfect. To be informed means to be imperfect. There's nothing informed that is perfect, if what you mean by perfect is that there are no rough edges. And so life leaves you to go through life, the ups, the downs, the ins, the outs, and come to that realization. It's what happened to Buddha, right? I love the story of him being let out into the world and trying on everything, right? Being with the aesthetics and laying on nails and being with the hedonists and ending up in all the body houses and realizing it's not there, it's not there, it's not there, but it's here, sitting under that tree, quietly, all that awareness coming to him. And all of us are the same. All of us are the same. It's not in the busyness of our lives that we find our relationship with that source. It's in the quiet. And most of us only get to that place when we've been broken by other things, when we've been disappointed by our wanderings. And so the ask is not to avoid those things, but to lean into them. A fool who persists in his folly will eventually become wise. Have you allowed yourself to be a fool? Have you allowed yourself to make mistakes? Have you taken from these teachings that you are connected to a perfect, whole, and complete source, divine mind, intelligence, an unchanging good? But has that belief in that thing been grounded in a knowing? Or has it been grounded in a performing? Some of us come to these teachings and we begin to perform what we think holy and godly looks like. We talk about unity and love and consciousness, and we use all the big fancy words that we learned at the last conference or retreat that we attended. But then we get into conflict with our wife or our husband, or we flip off the driver next to us, or we struggle to make sense of the discord that we see in our world or in our world, because sometimes we focus too much on the world, separate and apart from ourselves, that we don't see the discord in our world, right here at home, right here in me. And so we use all of these ideas to bypass the difficulty, to bypass the discord, to bypass what happened to you when you were 6 years old that you never told anybody about, to bypass what you did at 25 years old that you hope nobody talks about. And so these teachings, these ideas are to bring us into right relationship with ourselves. And so sometimes it takes, like the Quakers found, the quiet. One of the other things about the Quaker community that I love is that there's no form to their waiting worship. There's not a way to sit. There's not a word to recite. Sometimes people are sitting there digging their nose, picking their nails, sitting in the discomfort. And I remember my first couple of times attending service being so uncomfortable. I need somebody to give me an anchor, give me an affirmation, a prayer, a statement of intent. What's our aims? What are we led by? What do we value? And all that I was being reminded to do was just be quiet. God is not in the details, but in the dirt, black like absence or stillness, the silence left behind, when all the prophets and princes and the imagined man above forsake. I'm offering this today because I, like everybody else, I think is so overwhelmed by all of the details, all of the data, all the information, all of the constant conversation and opinions in the world right now. And it feels so overwhelming. There's discord everywhere, everywhere. And some days I feel like I'm drowning in it. But our invitation is to step out of the details, which the ego loves. That data, that information that the ego uses to separate itself from everybody else. Ways of standing above or standing under others. And instead, ground yourself in the dirt. What do you feel right now in your body? What do you feel in the pit of your stomach? For some of us, there is this annoying hum of dis-ease in the background of our lives that we keep at bay with lots of work or lots of friends or drink or drugs, all opportunities to escape. But like that old song says, can't sleep at night and you don't know why. Maybe God is trying to tell you something. And so I invite you into your dark spaces, into those difficult places like I experienced all those years ago in England. I don't know if I believe what I believe. I don't know if I know. I feel so lost. I feel so unsure. I feel so alone. Don't spiritually bypass whatever it is that you're going through right now. Lean into that. Feel that. Allow that to break you. And in the breaking, maybe, just maybe, God, that generating, that organizing, that delivering intelligence that governs all things, that divine mind that each of our individual minds are connected to, source, Christ consciousness, Allah, Krishna, whatever. Maybe then it can be heard, be seen, be experienced through you. I'm coming upon the end of our time, so I'm going to end this off in the same way that we opened out. I'm going to invite you to take 3 breaths with me. And then if you feel so led, you can close your eyes. And then I'll close out. Okay? All right. 3 breaths. Darkness, be that fence around me. Pull me to your edges and let me linger in your presence. Absence, be that fence around me. Pull me to your edges and let me linger in your presence. Stillness, be that fence around me. Pull me to your edges and let me linger in your presence. Silence,